Todd, Harra, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really looking forward to talking with you about your history related to the funeral industry and your profession generally. So, thank you for taking the time.
Thanks, Ashley. It's good to be on your podcast.
I always like to start hearing a little bit about where you grew up and what kind of kid you were.
I would say I was a writer from an early age. To be a writer, you definitely have to be a reader. And as a kid, I enjoyed being outdoors and hiking and biking and all those things that kids like to do. But I also very much love to read. And this is something that my parents fostered from an early age, always encouraging me to read. I think we had 3 or 7 channels on the TV, but I always liked to read as a kid, and that's something that carries forward today. I still have a huge stack of books on my nightstand that I read every day.
I love that. So, you were an outdoors kid, but you also always loved to read.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that the reading in any way shaped your profession? I know that your family life did, so I want to hear about that as well.
Honestly, even from an early age, I always wanted to be a writer. I got into the profession really as I needed a day job. Unless you're John Grisham or somebody of that ilk, making a living as a writer is terribly difficult, as anyone that's ever tried it will tell you. So I got into the profession not because it was expected of me, but because I had an interest in it. And once I started doing the work, I really fell in love with it. But it's not what I would call the kind of the legacy funeral homes that you think of. Neither of my parents are in the funeral profession. My mom was a school teacher and my dad was a pilot. So I started working for my uncle. He's the one that kind of took the mantle of the family undertaking legacy. So I started working for him 21 years ago and just doing the things that somebody typically trying to break into the profession does, washing the cars, running the errands, doing the night work and stuff like that. And again, just fell in love with the profession. And 21 years later, now I own the funeral home.
So, did the funeral home start with your great grandfather?
It was my 3 great grandfather. His name was James White. He had a cabinet making business in Milford, Delaware. And as was the tradition of the time, a person with a certain skill set or a certain set of equipment, they were called a tradesman undertaker. So
Mm.
your person that maybe owned the livery stable in town would essentially have the wagons and carriages needed for a funeral. Joiners, carpenters, even chandlers. Typically, those were going to be your undertakers in your small rural towns. At this time, we're talking 1830, 1840, 1850, in a very rural agrarian society, a small Delaware town. The town would bring James a piece of knotted string, and the length of the string would be the height of their decedent. And from the first knot to the second knot would be the width of their head, second to third, width of their shoulders, or their elbows, excuse me. And then the third to fourth knot would be the width of their feet. So he would make a custom coffin and take it to the house. Back in those days, coffins were not pre-made, mass-produced like they are today. They were all custom built to fit. And that's how he got into the business. And his son, Isaac, actually he had 2 sons, Harrison and Isaac. Harrison did it for a while. Isaac really took the mantle and ran with it. Isaac served in the Union Army during the Civil War. And of course, this is the time when embalming is coming to the forefront of the American kind of consciousness and becomes a accepted funeral practice at this time. All had to do with the shipping of the Union dead back home for burial. And so Isaac brings this, essentially it's a wartime technology back to this small town. And he really is conducting a brisk business. Looking back at the family records, he's doing about 100 death calls a year, which for one person, that's a lot of business. And if we look back in the census books, he's listed as a carpenter by trade. Isaac is building the coffins like his father did. And his wife, Rachel, she was a woman that was very much ahead of her time. She owned her own business. She had a milliner's shop. So Rachel knew how to sew. So it was very much a husband and wife operation. Isaac would build the coffins and Rachel would sew the interiors for them. And they had one child, a daughter. And this is the turn of the 20th century. And Isaac told his daughter, he said, this profession is no place for a woman, which is laughable looking at it from a 2026 lens, when I think the statistic is every mortuary graduating mortuary class now is majority women, something like 70 or 80% women. Women are going to be the new face of the profession in a generation. But it's comical to think that 120 years ago, this is what, he's telling his daughter, who had an interest in the business. And it skipped a couple generations, and my uncle took up the family profession as it is, and then I took it on from him.
So when your great grandfather James started, were they not sewing interiors? Was it just the custom coffin without a sewn interior?
Likely, yes. Until recently, factory made caskets and coffins a lot of times would come to the undertaker. They would what they would call it, trim it up, put the interior in it. They would line it themselves. A lined casket is really something that's probably of maybe the last 75 years. Up until then, you see undertakers trimming their own coffins. Rewinding back to pre-Civil War, you're not going to see coffins with lining inside them. They were very rustic and rudimentary. During the wake, as it was, people were typically waked in their beds. During that time, the community would come, they would pay their respects. Sometimes, if they were, of Scotch Irish descent, have the ceremonial drink and the puff of tobacco. The undertaker would probably be a day or two post death before he was able to get the custom made coffin there. Now, I was in Williamsburg a couple weeks ago and went into the joiner shop, and the interpreter there was telling me that, colonial times, it would take a joiner about 2 days to build a panel door. So I think that's probably a pretty good approximation of how much time it would take James to build a custom made coffin. Now, when I say coffin, I'm talking about something that has six sides plus a top and a bottom. Most people typically think of that as like maybe the Dracula type burial vessel. Whereas today in modern America, we use caskets, which have four sides plus the top and the bottom. And that's a whole nother historical aside. But we see this shift from American taste in coffins to caskets around 1880. Almost overnight, the demand for coffins disappears, and you see the casket emerge as the favored burial vessel for the American public.
Why is that?
It had to do with the Victorian softening of death, which was fed by the Civil War. So we see these very softening of the death ritual around this time. We see more floral tributes are being offered. You're surrounding the ugliness of death with the beauty and vibrance of flowers. That's very much a Victorian thing. Victorians were very into using euphemisms around death. People didn't die in Victorian era, in the Gilded Age. They have gone to their rest. They've gone to their sleep. And we see this on casket plates and in the newspaper notices. And we also see transfer of people no longer want to be buried in something that is humanoid shaped, which a coffin is. Casket is a French word for casse, which is a small chest where you put jewels in. We're now burying our dead in a treasure chest, so to speak, that doesn't look as grim and it doesn't sound as grim. So it really appealed to the Victorian sense of this new way of lessening the blow of a dead loved one or a dead family member. This all feeds back into the trauma of the Civil War, where we had 650,000 of our husbands, brothers, sons, you name it, march off to war and just disappeared in a 4-year period. So, there was a lot of national trauma involved in the Civil War, and the Victorian kind of funeral practices that come out of that period really reflect all this, what I see as unresolved grief from the American public. And how can we deal with this as a nation?
So I know that embalming, as you said, really found its place in the American consciousness as a result of the Civil War, because you had all of these young dead men who died in the South and they had to be transported back to the North. And then I also know that Abraham Lincoln's death and embalming really maybe lit that fire even further, so that there was this fundamental, not just acceptance, but embrace of embalming. Do you think that is partially this unresolved trauma from grief? Like, these young men went off to war, they came back, and they looked like themselves, even though they were dead, immortalizing Lincoln. What do you think that connection is to why, as a country, we really moved towards embalming?
It absolutely has to do with that. I would say that the inciting incident is definitely Lincoln's funeral. A sobering fact, only 6% of the Civil War dead were ever embalmed and sent home. That's a
Mm.
shockingly small number. It works out to about 35,000 soldiers. And unfortunately, it was something that was reserved for typically the officer class, people that are coming from families of means that can afford this service, essentially, because at this time, this was all a private service. The government was not caring for the fallen dead. So it was up to a family to find an agent or an embalming surgeon who would, first of all, locate their dead soldier, which that in itself was usually a nightmare, as the battlefields had been picked over by men scavenging for ammunition and warm clothes and boots and things like that. So typically a lot of identifying valuables and stuff were stripped off the soldier. So it really became a nightmare to, first of all, identify, but okay, we've got the right person. And then the cost was just astronomical compared to what an American family was typically earning at the time. Depending on the rank of the person, I think a good kind of average number is you were looking at about $100 to locate, embalm, and ship somebody home, which we're talking about 25% of a family's annual income at the time. So a huge proportion, insurmountable for most families, hence the very small number. Lincoln being shot about a week after Lee surrenders at Appomattox, Lincoln had been a very early kind of adopter and champion of embalming. He had two very good friends who were killed very early in the war. Elmer Ellsworth, he was actually the first Union officer who was shot and killed in the war. And he had been Lincoln's law clerk in Springfield, dear friend of the Lincolns. And he had him embalmed so he could be shipped home to New York for burial. And Mrs. Lincoln, they brought Elmer's body to the White House for a funeral before he was shipped up to New York. And Mrs. Lincoln remarked to her husband, she said, "He looks natural. He looks like he's just sleeping." And here's a guy who had been shot point blank in the chest with a shotgun. Okay. And you think about it, Ashley, at this time in America, Americans are caring for their own dead. So they're washing them, they're dressing them, they're placing them in the coffin, okay, for burial. So at this time, Americans are very in tune with the sights, sounds, and smells of death. They know what decomposition looks like and smells like. And here's this young officer who's been shot in the chest. And most Americans were very familiar with firearms at this time, and they would have known how a devastating wound like that would have accelerated decomposition. And here's Ellsworth laid out at the White House, and he looks like he's sleeping. So it was almost like the embalmer had performed a miracle. And we see this 4 years later when Lincoln, of course, is shot in the head, and the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, orders him to be embalmed. And he's going to go on this 11 city funeral tour, if you will. That's almost a facsimile reverse of his inaugural train ride. So he's offloaded in 11 cities. And I think Stanton's quote, what he said was, "I want the American public to see what they've done to him," meaning Lincoln. He understood the importance of that, but it's also why he didn't have the embalmers cover up the black when he was shot in the head. The blood the capillaries leaks. Lincoln's eyes were very dark from the wound. But you have all these Americans in these cities, and some of them, like especially out in Chicago and Springfield, the final stop. So they're seeing Lincoln 2.5 weeks in some cases after he's been shot in the head. And there's the chief magistrate looking just like he essentially would have in life. And many Americans at this time had never seen anything like this. They didn't even know this existed. Even though it had been used for 4 years during the war, they probably hadn't had an experience with an officer friend where they had gotten to view a body that had been shipped home from one of these far flung battlefields. So to many Americans, it was like, oh my gosh, these embalmers, like they've performed a miracle. And the general sentiment became that if it's good enough for the president, then it's good enough for my husband, for my wife, for my son, for my daughter, for my parents. And so Lincoln was viewed by 880,000 people, okay, during his funeral train journey. And that was 3% of the American population. I don't think anyone's been viewed in a single event more untelevised than Lincoln in about 100 years or over 100 years at this point. But it was Lincoln's appearance 2 weeks post death was just nothing short of astounding.
So it makes sense to me in the historical context that as a result of that, as you say, a wife says, if it's good enough for Lincoln, it's good enough for my husband, etc. And it becomes an American death ritual. I want to talk about how that's changed with cremation and now this new era of human composting and other death rituals. But something that you said really struck me. So you said at this time, people were washing, taking care of their dead, putting them in their coffins, and they knew and were very familiar with the sights, sounds, and smells of death. I personally think, and I wonder what you think about this, that losing that was actually a terrible thing to lose. And that we as a society are still really struggle with death. And maybe we always will. But I started doing an annual series having to do with death and dying because I really feel like we don't talk about it enough and we don't prepare for it enough. And this started with my father died 11 years ago of a rare cancer, and he was sick for 14 years when he died, and he had not chosen where he was going to be buried. He knew the cemetery, but my stepmom and my sisters and I had to go while he was in like hospice wing of the hospital to actually choose a plot. This is a man who knew he was going to die and he hadn't planned for it. And I feel like there's so much unresolved for so many people in as death approaches, and it is the most inevitable thing of our lives. So I wonder if this wondrous, miraculous wartime technology that did give Americans, I think, something real and powerful in being able to view Lincoln's body across all of these stops across the country, also took something away from us that I think is equally, if not more powerful or devastating.
I agree with you 100%. It's not just our dead. We, the American people, have institutionalized our elderly into nursing homes and our sick into hospitals and convalescent homes. And these are all things that, back during the Civil War and before, you would have had these extended families. So you would have had elderly parents or aunts and uncles living in your house when they got sick. Of course, medicine was a completely different thing at the time, and people tended to avoid hospitals unless they absolutely had to go there. The sick were cared for at home, and then, of course, when they passed, they were cared for in the homes. The family took care of everything. At some point, Americans decided we'd rather outsource all this. You'd probably agree with me that American culture, we're a very kind of death denying, death defying culture. There's nothing sexy about talking about death as a culture. I think we tend to avoid it until we can't. Like your situation when somebody's in hospice and it's essentially literally knocking on your door and you have to deal with it.
Yeah. Are you seeing any evolution in that as in your funeral home? I do think and have seen an opening for some younger people to get more comfortable being uncomfortable, I guess is the best way I could
It,
put it.
yes, this whole death doula movement where they're reintroducing families to the dying process, I think that's valuable to educate people as to that whole process, because it is definitely a stage of life and might be more drawn out than people are aware of, and it's bringing people back into tune with, okay, this is what this end stage of somebody's life looks like. Education, just like anything else, is the key. I'll do a guest lecture for the University of Delaware's nursing students as to, okay, here are some things to arm you with. So when the family of a dying patient says, what do we do next? This is what I do as a funeral professional. Here's some takeaways so you can maybe educate them and it's not such a daunting or scary process for them. Because a lot of times, if people are educated on something, whatever it may be, if you educate yourself on, then you can say, okay, let me look at this and see what my options are and go from there. And that was the whole impetus for writing this book, was let me break down the historic reasons of why we do everything in a funeral. And a lot of times if you look back and say, oh, that makes sense, and suddenly a funeral and all the rituals and symbols associated with it that seem very kind of morbid and spooky and scary to an outsider, hopefully then it becomes more of an accessible thing, not as scary, and can hopefully become more of the healing ritual that it's meant to be. The funeral is supposed to start people on their grief journey if it's done properly.
I want to ask, you had mentioned at the beginning that you always wanted to be a writer and you fell into this profession maybe as a way to pay the bills as you were writing. Now you've melded them together, but you also said you really fell in love with the profession. So I want to hear, what did you fall in love with? How quickly did that happen when it became not just this is how I'm going to pay the bills, but this is something that I want to dedicate my life to? And then and it's just obvious talking to you, you love the history of it. And then you've decided to write about it from a historical perspective as well.
The funeral profession is a helping profession, and there's nothing more gratifying to me than at the end of a funeral or the end of my time of helping a family, they say to me, thank you, this is not what we expected, this has been a very meaningful experience. And they might not say it in those words, you know what they mean. And I have this little box in my office, and one of the guys, a guy that taught me postmortem reconstruction, his name's Fernie Fountain. He's nationally known for his reconstruction work, and he calls them the praise letters. And people will send me a simple thank you days or weeks after the funeral, and it might not seem like much, but you look back and say, wow, I've touched these people's lives in a positive way. And there aren't too many professions where you get to make a positive impact in somebody's life and you've done it. But just seeing what a difference you can make in somebody's life. And people, when they first walk through the door and we've taken their loved one into our care, maybe we haven't at that point, but typically they're in crisis. Somebody's died, somebody they love has died, they don't know what to do. Usually by the time they have left the funeral conference, you can see a noticeable change in them, because it's okay, we've got a plan in place. I know what's going to happen. We're going to honor my loved one's life and it's going to be beautiful. They've calmed a little bit, that we've put things in place, and that's very rewarding to see as well.
Yeah. So my mother had a stationery and gift shop when I was growing up. And so from a young age, we were taught to write thank you notes, and which is, I think, also a dying art, especially today. Somebody taking the time to actually write you a note is exceptional in itself because it's so rarely done. So to me, that just means you really have had a really, regardless of what the note says, the fact that they took the time to write it and put it in the mail is a very big indicator of the impact that you're having. And I love this idea of this praise box and that you keep them and that it's a reminder of the good that you're doing.
Yeah. And sometimes you just need to look at the box when you're having a rough day or it's been a tough case. And it's like, just glance at the box and say, okay, this day and age, it's so easy to send somebody a text or fire off an email. Somebody sits down and puts pen to paper. I'd like to think gone above and beyond, that they've taken the time to do that, something that's almost a lost art or a lost courtesy.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so you fell in love with the impact that you have, but, and then you always were a reader. And then did you become enamored with the history of it early on, or was that later? And when did you decide to write about it?
It was much later, and it actually had to do with, I was reading a book and a light bulb went off. And the book was Bellevue, it was called 3 Centuries of Medicine and Mayhem. And somebody had given me the book because where I went to mortuary school in New York, we did our embalming clinicals in Bellevue. So they gave me this book, and I looked at the book and I was like, great, a book about a hospital. This is going to be thrilling. And I read the book, and it's probably one of my favorite books of all times. And the author, David Ashinsky, basically, and it's not just about Bellevue. He walks you through how modern medicine came to be and a lot of the historic reasons behind it. And I'm reading this book, and I don't know anything about medicine. I was fascinated. I thought, if he did this for medicine, I said, somebody could do this for funeral service. And I am not a trained researcher, so I just started reading everything I could on funeral history and started really bearing down on the subject. Old funeral journals, trade magazines, if you will, from the 19th century, and just anything I could get my hands on, which in some cases was very difficult because I feel like funeral history and ephemera is not valued like a lot of other professions. I get the sense that there's a lot of stuff that might just be lost to history forever. But I was able to compile this great little manuscript on funeral history, and I pitched the idea to an agent. They loved it. And once I sold the book, I think when I pitched, I had written 4 chapters, and I was like, uh-oh. Now I got to read the rest. I was able to do it. It all came from that whole kind of getting into funeral history came from reading a book about medicine.
Okay, and now tell us about the book. It's called Last Rites. Tell us who you hope will read it and what you hope they will take from it.
I tell people I wrote this book for someone like my mom, in the sense that she is not a funeral professional. She really knows nothing about the profession. So I wrote it for somebody who knows zero about funerals and the rituals and the symbols associated with it, in the hopes that they could read this book and learn something, be entertained as well, because I'm telling stories, right? It's not a textbook. Like, who wants to read a textbook? I'm giving you this information through stories. And you, at the end of the book, you can say, oh, that's interesting. That's why we use caskets and not coffins. And this is why we send flowers to a funeral. And this is why we embalm our dead. It's because of Lincoln's funeral. And so you can have some context as to why we do all these things in the American funeral, why the mourning ritual is important and, dare I say, necessary. I know some would argue with me. What's the old saying? If you ask a barber if you need a haircut, if you ask a funeral director if you need a funeral, what's the answer you're going to get? I wholeheartedly believe in the service I provide. I think it's not only necessary, I think it's vital. And we saw this in the COVID pandemic when people weren't allowed to have funerals. When you take that from people, that chance to say goodbye, I think it catches people in this kind of perpetual grief cycle. So I think there might be this whole kind of group of people that are going to be perpetual mourners because they never got the chance to say goodbye. And that right there is the power and the necessity of a funeral, being able to say goodbye. Benefit, or the positive that I think has come out of that, is that people now realize what it's like not to have a service. And I think people now value a funeral service more in 2026 than they did maybe in 2018 or 19. We get people that come in and let's, oh, we'll do a direct cremation. And a direct cremation is a cremation with no service. And if that's what somebody wants, fine. And I've had younger family members, grandchildren pipe up, Mom, Dad, we did that for grandmom. I don't want to do that for granddad. Okay. And so it's interesting that even young people are, they absolutely do, and they're in tune with it. And they had that experience and they didn't like that. It actually was a non event. It wasn't even an experience. They didn't get to experience it and they didn't like that. I think young people, especially that lived through the pandemic, and maybe even it's more acutely felt by young people that got to miss out on a lot of things like prom and homecoming and living in dorms because they had to go to virtual school. They want and they value these experiences that were essentially robbed from them or unavailable to them during COVID. It's as tough as COVID was, it's been interesting to see what's come out of it in all facets of life, but it's been especially interesting for me to see how it's affected funeral service.
So, you wrote this book, Last Rites, about the history of the funeral profession, industry, rituals in the United States. What do you see coming? What do you think? How do you think in 100 years, hopefully one of your ancestor or one of your family members in the future who takes over this business, what do you think they're going to see? What do you hope they're going to see? What And I guess what I'm asking is, I'm doing this whole series on death rituals, which I think are both fascinating and extremely educational for us to learn from, to decide what we want for ourselves and for our family members, our loved ones. And in some ways, they're different. And you've already told us how they change with historical events. And that's going to continue to happen. I would imagine that's going to continue to happen. But at the end of the day, they are all about closure, honor, remembrance, grieving. And so I'm wondering both what you think will happen and what you hope will happen.
Actually, I noticed how when you just said honoring and grieving, you didn't mention anything about disposition. People get so hung up on final disposition, and everyone's wishes for that are different and they're all valid and they're all fine. Whether you want to be buried or have a green burial or be cremated or be subjected to natural organic reduction or water cremation, as it's sometimes called. I think the important thing with funeral service is finding a meaningful way for you, the bereaved, to celebrate somebody's life and kind of the impact it had on your lives and the community, and doing it in such a way that when it's over, okay, and whether you do that from a secular standpoint, I would say probably 50% of the families I'm dealing with now are unchurched. So the what I have to do is find out a way for them to meaningfully honor their loved one's life, because when somebody comes to me and they says, "Oh, I'm Catholic," or "I'm Presbyterian," or whatever religion they may be, there's a prescribed rubric. It's okay, we're going to do this and this within your religious context. And there's pattern, if you will, for people to follow. And that can be very helpful for when you're bereaved, you're in a time of crisis. And it's very nice to have a pattern and say, okay, this is what I do when this happens. But not everyone is religious these days. So it's my job sometimes is to offer suggestions because people are casting about looking to mom, dad, whoever was not religious. What do we do? And I'm saying, we could try this, and we have funeral celebrants, and I've seen people do this, and just talking with people, getting a feel for who they are, who they're who the decedent was, and how their family operates. And it's okay, I can make some suggestions based on what you've told me to create something of meaning so you can begin to heal once we've had this ceremony. And that's the real value in the funeral ceremony. What do I think is probably going to have the biggest impact? Obviously, technology. I could certainly foresee a scenario where, in, gosh, I don't know even how many years this would be. With the speed technology moves, this could be 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, where, you know, we mail out VR goggles and doing essentially virtual viewings, maybe in a virtual setting, a beach where I'm sitting on my couch and you're sitting on your couch, Ashley, but we're greeting Mrs. Smith, who just lost her husband, Mr. Smith, and we're doing it on the beaches of Tahiti. I can see technology shaping the way we engage with each other at funerals. Holograms, who knows, maybe that will be a way for the decedent to offer a message of hope or sing a song or something at their own funeral. That could be very meaningful for people. Who knows, maybe there's a QR code on people's monument at the cemetery if they choose to be buried, where you go up and you scan that QR code, and somehow you can interact with them, whether it's on your phone or via hologram. I think we'll see some very interesting things come out of the ways we funeralize people in the future as it relates to technology, just as long as we don't lose sight of the important thing, the service, the ceremony, the send off, marking the end of somebody's life, the period at the end of the sentence.
Yeah. One of the things that I plan to discuss with another guest, and I'm wondering if you've heard about this, is this whole concept of uploading consciousness. Is that something that you've researched or read about or talked to others about?
I really haven't heard too much about it. Is this kind of related to Neuralink and all that
Yeah.
type of? Okay.
It's when you're talking about this, and I can see it. There's like a hologram of the person who's died, and they can interact. And it could be beautiful, or it could be not honoring them. Like, I think it could go either direction.
Right.
So it's like anything in technology. I think hopefully we're just going to have to be.
You see the same thing with even something like a simple eulogy. I've heard some fantastic eulogies over the years, and then you hear some that kind of miss the mark. It's the same thing with really anything. I guess it all comes down to execution, like what's the meaning, the intent, and all that behind it. So, yeah, I could definitely see a hologram also missing the mark.
And I'm just thinking as you're saying this, so I completely agree with you on the importance of the ceremony and as a starting point of grieving. And I am not personally religious, although I grew up religious. And I do really believe religion is amazing in times of like great joy and great sorrow because it prescribes what to do. And there's so much power in ritual. And honestly, I think there's so much wisdom in religious ritual, particularly as it pertains to death, that there was just a lot of learning over the years about what people needed to grieve and to heal. And those rituals are designed to provide those. So I'm going to have some discussions about some of those more religious rituals as well. I did have a really interesting conversation with a woman from Olvera Street on Dios de los Muertos. And one of the things I love about that ritual or those rituals is that it's annual. So every year you create an altar to your loved ones who have died, and you put offerings, right? Whether it's food or incense or pieces of clothing or something. So it's not this sort of one and done funeral ceremony, but it's this ongoing remembrance. And I think many people probably have an ongoing remembrance either on the birthday or the death day of their loved one. But many of us just sort of like, oh, it's a day I don't want to think about. Instead of wanting to engage with it, we want to not engage with it. What can you tell us historically about American funeral services and this sort of the importance of this one ceremony and not this revisiting on a regular basis?
I think there's a lot of power in kind of this having a remembrance. In the Jewish faith, they have a service after, I think it's 40 days, and then the 1 year anniversary. And it's a chance to revisit and have another ceremony, different stages in your grieving process. And I think there's definitely immense power in that. And people definitely, you're right. Some people want to lean into it and remember, and other people want to bury their head under the pillow and sleep the day away on maybe a death day of a spouse or a parent or something. But it, like, just for instance, my dad will, on the day of my grandparents' birthday or death day, so and so would have been this age today, or it's been 10 years, it's been 20 years since they died. And so that's a way he kind of remembers and connects. Not everyone grieves in the same way. The thing about grief is there's no right or wrong way to do it. There's the way that's going to work for you.
Or not work for you, or maybe some people are not putting, I don't want to say the effort because that's not really the word, but I think some of us are not letting it in, is what I'm trying to say. And I think that any ways we can encourage people to do that, I think is good. And I don't know if with technology or what you think it will take for Americans in particular to do that. To me, it's so interesting that embalming really took off after Lincoln's death. Cremation also really took off. Some death rituals seem to shift relatively quickly. I don't know what you think it will take for there to be a shift in the post ceremony death rituals, or what you think would engender that. I do feel like it's very cultural.
Yeah, it does seem to be very cultural and not the norm for the American death ritual. Once the funeral's over, that's been the American way. You move on, whether that's right or wrong. That's just the way we have funeralized our dead. Whereas the Romans would go on feast days and on dates of remembrance, they would go back to the burial site and they would actually have pipes installed in the graves, and they're called libation pipes. It was literally a pipe leading down into where the person was buried. And some of the mausoleums of the wealthier folks would even have kitchens in them. It was very important for them to, food was a big part of their death ritual. And so they would offer food to their dead as part of their remembrance ceremonies. And that's definitely something that's lacking in American funeral practices, is this reoccurring event after the fact. I think maybe the closest we can get we get to that is in the Victorian era when the rural cemetery comes about. We see these, instead of, they used to be called graveyards when they were in a town's commons or something, and then we have the invention of essentially the cemetery, this bucolic setting outside the city, a peaceful, serene setting. And it was not uncommon for Victorians to go and picnic and stroll around cemetery, something that I think the modern American might see as bizarre, but this is how the Victorians found they could reconnect with their dead after the fact. And it was on Sundays, it's let's go for a carriage ride in whatever the local rural cemetery was.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Do you think there's any hope of bringing any of that back?
I sure hope so. But culture changes, for some may say the good, the bad. Certainly, cemeteries can still be places of, they still are places of quiet and sanctuary. You get wildlife in there, even in urban settings. You might see deer in a cemetery. You think, how'd they get in there? But I think it would be a nice sentiment. But again, to my earlier comment, at this point in time in our culture, that kind of behavior would almost be viewed as, what are you doing? Some of these cemeteries, they give ghost tours. They're trying to engage people back into the cemetery. So I do applaud the cemeteries that are making moves to have events at them, because they are space for people to, they can go and meditate, or they're very peaceful places.
Actually, we all happened to be in town, or almost all of my family, on my dad's death day. And we went to the cemetery and we brought a picnic. And one of my nieces started a group, go around the group and tell grandpa what's going on in your life. And It in the beginning it felt a little strange, and it was such a wonderful thing because we all got to share and hear about each other in a way that we probably wouldn't, just sitting around the table having a meal. Honor and remember my dad. So it was really nice. But trying to get everybody together for this big thing is also hard. So this idea of a Sunday stroll is really nice. Now, in those times, people probably stayed where they grew up more than they tend to do today. So I do think the geography becomes challenging. And frankly, and I don't know if you know Recompose, but I think what Katrina Spade is doing, and she started her research was started urbanism. Like, how are we going to continue to have cemeteries in urban, like we're literally going to run out of space? I think that's a concern too, whether you live in the city or many people live in the city and the population increases over time, there's only so much room. So we probably will need to have new rituals for remembrance.
Yes. In urban settings, you do see cemetery spaces getting tighter and tighter. Cremation is certainly alleviating some of that. You certainly need a lot less real estate with cremation. And look at what New York did once the population swelled. They went up into the air. If you have a columbarium of that's a spot for cremated remains and a little niche for each set of cremated remains that is not a high rise. Instead of individual plots on the ground, you can fit many more sets of cremains in this patch of ground than if you had buried, several caskets. There are ways that cemeteries are getting creative, creating new and more grave spaces. I'm not sounding the alarm bells like some other people, like, oh my gosh, we're running out of grave space. Florida opened something like 3 new cemeteries last year alone. There's space out there. It just is not as accessible in the urban settings. Do I think we need to be careful and with our existing cemetery space so we don't run out of it? Absolutely. Everything in moderation. But these alarm bells people are sounding about that we're running out of grave space, I, it's not that I disagree with it. I just don't think it's as dire as some people want you to believe at the moment.
And I do think coming back to it, it really should be about what brings the people who are still alive peace, as much peace as they can get. And I personally think that people get the most peace when they know what the loved one who died wanted and then they
Right.
honor that wish.
Yeah.
And that's why I think we need to talk about it and plan for it, because I can't know what you want unless you tell me, right?
Absolutely. Actually, I've been doing this 21 years, and prearranging, it's when somebody comes in and they pre-plan their funeral. They don't necessarily have to prepay for it, but I think it's important for everyone to pre-plan their funeral. And if you want to prepay for it, God bless you. If not, that's fine as well. But I've never in 21 years had a survivor, whether it be children or a spouse or whomever, come in and say, gosh, I really wish mom, dad, husband, wife hadn't pre-planned. They're so relieved that the person they picked out exactly what they wanted, and they're relieved that they're following this person's wishes. And some people get very granular with their prearrangement, the music for the funeral and the photo for the prayer card, and that's fine. And some people, it's more broad strokes. I want to be buried in this cemetery and this minister or priest to preside, and that's okay too. I think as long as you're giving your family members some direction, or at least a starting point, that's the key. Because
Yeah.
I also deal with people that they have no idea what their loved one wanted at all. And that can certainly add additional stress at a time when stress levels are running extremely high.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. What have I not asked you? We've talked about a lot of things. There's so much more we could talk about, and people can read your book. Is there anything about the American funeral that we haven't talked about that you want to share?
Oh my God, there's so much, but I'll just go into one thing that completely surprised me digging into the materials. But a lot of times, if you go to a funeral home and you're arranging for a traditional burial, the funeral director is going to ask you about a vault selection or an outer burial container, as the Federal Trade Commission makes us call it. And people say, well, what do I need that for? Okay. And to my knowledge, now every state's different, 50 states, 50 sets of rules, but I don't believe there is a state law on any state's books that requires purchase of an outer burial container. What it is, cemeteries require them as a rule because it makes now maintenance for the cemetery easy. If you've ever been into an old, like pre-Civil War cemetery, you'll notice the ground is very uneven. You can very easily twist an ankle. Of course, the bigger problem for the cemetery is the toppling of the headstones. These outer burial containers make maintenance of the cemetery much easier. If you think about all the heavy machinery that's driving over cemetery grounds, backhoes and lawnmowers and stake body trucks, it keeps the graves from collapsing. But that was not the original intent of the outer burial container. They were invented to prevent the scourge of body snatching. And once I dug into kind of the scourge of body snatching in America, it was just unbelievable. The problem was, and it was one of those things where in order for medicine to advance, they needed anatomical material. And at the time, the religious dogma was that in order for somebody to be resurrected, they had to be resurrected whole. And if they had been dissected by a doctor, they wouldn't essentially be eligible for resurrection. So it was essentially a religious fear that people were scared to donate their body to science. And so most of this, almost all of this body snatching was by these men, this group of men, they were called resurrectionists, and they were professional body snatchers, and they would take people and sell them to medical schools. And it was very lucrative. You could get up to, by the turn of the 19th century, the turn of the 20th century, so the late 1800s, cadaver could fetch $50. All right. Now, the average labor at this time was making about $13 a week, working a 60-hour work week, about a month's wage for 20 minutes of time. So a skilled resurrectionist could boast, they'd dig a shaft down at the head end, they'd smash the head end of the coffin or the casket open, pull the remains up, have the hole filled back up, and be on their way with nobody being the wiser. And no one would know because they would fill the graves back in. We see this beginning all the way back in the 18th century. William Shippen is one of the earliest examples of being accused of body snatching. Somebody actually took a shot at him, and his defense was only taking bodies from Potter's Field. So again, it becomes a have and the have not. It's okay to pilfer anatomical research material from the Potter's Field. The haves, no, you can't do that. And we see this continue, this theme again and again. The riots that break out are when it's been suspected that somebody's been snatched from a cemetery where proper society is being buried. Americans, at one point, they decide to go on the offensive, right? And they begin inventing these devices. And we see the first device, it's called a coffin torpedo. And the actual patent for this states the ideal location is to be secreted under the pillow of the coffin. And the idea was when the resurrectionists would smash open the coffin, this thing was basically a shotgun barrel, and it was discharge in their face and kill them. Okay. And then shortly thereafter, we see something that was patented by an Ohio judge by the name of Thomas Howell. He patents a grave torpedo. So essentially a landmine, right? And one newspaper comments that maybe this is more of a moral lesson than a practical lesson, because if the resurrectionist disturbs this and this landmine goes off, think of the damage not only it's going to do the resurrectionist, but your loved one's remains. So people are so scared of the resurrectionists and the medical field dissecting their loved one, they would rather subject their loved one to be blown up by a landmine than be taken for anatomical study. That's how pervasive and real the fear was. And of course, I was all floored by this. I was like, they didn't teach us any of this in mortuary school. This is amazing. And we know, Ashley, that one of these devices worked because a guy by the name of, I think his name was Russell Harrell in Gann, Ohio, his daughter had been recently buried, and a resurrectionist by the name of Dipper went to dig her up, and he had used a coffin torpedo, and it took Dipper's head off. And by the amount of blood left in the snow, the authorities suspected it had also severely injured Dipper's accomplice. But there was a driver. It was snowing out. It was Ohio. It was winter, so they had a getaway sleigh. So the driver helped this guy, and they managed to get away. But we know these devices worked, and so my thought has always been, how many of these are still in existence? And somebody doing a legitimate disinterment or digging next to a grave that has one of these grave torpedoes in it is going to potentially set one of these off. Now, I've never heard of that happening, but it's been a thought ever since I learned about these torpedoes. But shortly thereafter, a guy by the name of Andrew Van Bibber invents it's basically a mort safe. So it's like a cage to go around the coffin. Sure, it had locks that a resurrectionist could pick. If he's digging that, or next to it is a completely unprotected coffin, he's going to go after the easy pickings. And then a year later, we see George Boyd. He patents the steel burial vault. Okay. So in early trade magazines, this is advertised not as something that's going to protect the coffin from the elements and keep the cemetery looking nice, but they're advertised as burglar proof. Fast forward several decades, when people start donating their body to science, we have this complete shift in American culture, the thought behind it, and the resurrectionists go the way of the horse and buggy. But cemeterians, they look around and they say, wow, these graves that had these burglar proof vaults, they're not collapsing. Their monuments aren't toppling over. So then it becomes this shift in marketing from burglar proof to something that's element proof. And also the cemeterians want them because it's going to keep costs of maintenance down. So that was fascinating to me, this complete shift in, okay, what we're going to market this product that's exactly the same as it was when it came out 150 years ago. It's the exact same product, but the marketing for it is completely different and the use for it is completely different. You don't need to worry about resurrectionists anymore because plenty of people see the value in donating their organs for transplant and their bodies for medical science. And again, that's a philosophy shift and theology shift, and so many pieces have moved around, but it was something that I had kind of no idea about until I kind of got into it. And there's a whole chapter on the resurrectionists in the book,
Okay.
and kind of by and large, everyone. That's the chapter everyone likes, the chapter on body snatching.
That is a wild historical lesson. And it is also such a great example of how rituals change and our reasoning changes, but some things can stay the same. So we can still have the protection, but the reason is totally different today.
Yeah.
Can you briefly tell us how long mortuary school is and highlights of what you're learning?
It's different programs you can work at a different pace. It's 2 to 4 years, depending on, maybe you have a full-time job and you're going to school just online or at night. If you worked it as a full-time student, it's a 2-year associate's degree in most states. And I want to say there's 56 mortuary schools across the nation. I was one of the first online students. I think I started in 2008. And now online learning is the way, or most mortuary schools are, if they're not completely online, they have a hybrid schedule in addition to in-class learning.
Some of it, I would imagine, don't you have to be there in person? Isn't there some things you have to learn?
Yes, I went to school completely online except for the last 2 courses, the restorative art and the clinical embalming. But everything else up to that point was lecture, textbook, out of the book. But you're right. Even if you're in a 100% online program, there's going to still be certain things you're going to need to do hands-on to complete the program. Mortuary school is typically divided up into, I'd call it 2 sections, the hard sciences and the soft sciences, chemistry, anatomy, pathology. You take different embalming courses that get subsequently more difficult, but you're also learning accounting. You actually take a class called funeral directing. You take grief, psychology. Some schools call it thanatology. So courses like that to prepare you for the funeral directing side, dealing with the families, running a business, all non-scientific things that go into that part of the job.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I have to imagine that there's just a lot of on the job learning. And you had your uncle to help you,
Yeah.
and I'm sure many other people who worked there. But I think, particularly on the soft side of things, there's probably a lot to learn from the people who've been doing it.
And believe it or not, there's a national standard for embalming, but the standard for funeral directing is really local because
Hmm.
it's so specific to each community. You might be the best undertaker in your town. You move 100 miles away, you might be clueless as to the nuance of their death rituals. Each community is definitely has their own take on how they bury their dead or how they memorialize their dead. And again, that's what your internship, your apprenticeship is. You're learning how to do those things. Essentially funeral direct and also embalm outside once you get out of school.
So at the end of every episode, I like to ask the same question. So let's dive into those. My first one is, as we explore in my brand, Amatand, which is French for to take care of your soul, objects can hold a lot of meaning for us and tie us to the past, enable us to enjoy the present, or even take us into the future. Can you share an object from your life, whether you still have it or not, that holds a lot of meaning for you, and tell us why?
Sure. I am not working today, so I'm not wearing my watch. But the day we got married, my wife gave me a watch, and it's like a daily reminder. Just looking down at it, you glance at the time as a funeral director 40 times a day, but it's something that reconnects me to her and the life we've built and the family we've built. And it's just nice to be able to have a reoccurring remembrance of that day, essentially wear it, bring it with me, everywhere I go.
I love that. It's beautiful. I have not heard that one. Can you share a favorite tradition with us? It could be something from when you were a child or something you do with your family today, anything at all.
Sure. Earlier in the podcast, I was telling you about the joiner's shop I was in a few weeks ago. Back in, I guess it was 1946, as my grandfather was coming back from World War II, the troop transport train he was on just happened to stop in Virginia behind the governor's palace of the newly created Colonial Williamsburg. And he thought to himself, wow, this would be a nice place to bring my new wife. He had just gotten married before he went off to war. He did. And every year at Christmas time since then, our family has reconvened in Colonial Williamsburg. At the beginning, it was renting a colonial house. Now the family's grown so big, we rent an entire tavern. It's more about gathering with the family and reconnecting. And it's at holiday time, but it's decorated for the season. When I think of that, I think of family. I also think of the holiday season. It's just a nice thing. I can remember going there as a kid, and now my kids go there and they get to see their cousins that they don't get to see much the rest of the year. I see them doing the same stuff I did 35, 40 years ago.
That's very cool. So cool. Are you in a phase in your life where you enjoy entertaining in your home? Why or why not?
Yes.
Hesitant, yes.
It's great to have people over and sit around maybe your backyard fire pit or gather at the kitchen counter, especially this time of year. The house is decorated nice. The holidays are almost like a funeral or a wedding, a special occasion. We pause this time of year to decorate our houses to look nice. We take time out of our lives to do something like you do for those other special events in your life, like a wedding or a funeral. You pause your life to attend that event and pay tribute to whatever's happening, whether it be a couple uniting or somebody who has passed. But it's especially this time of year when you've taken the time to decorate your house. And you've, for me, have good memories of the holidays. Let's invite friends and family in and continue to make those nice memories. But it's great any time of year. Summertime, have the grill on, pop a cup of cold ones with your neighbors. Really, anytime's a good time to have people over and share stories over food and drink.
Yeah. Sometimes people are daunted by like they have to prepare a big meal or they have to set a nice table. And I think it's just nice for people to hear like there are multiple ways. There's not one way to do it. And it's just about being together. Todd, thank you so much for joining me. So excited to read your book. And I've learned so much. And I hope you're going to write another one. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to this episode of On the Table with Ashley with our guest, Todd Harra. Again, you can find Todd's book, Last Rites, The Evolution of the American Funeral, wherever books are sold.